when I was 15, I was the first or youngest member of the American Rocket Society. so, I used to make my own too, sometimes with interesting results.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff here, coming to you for another episode of Work 20XX, and this is a really special edition. I think we might have to put a little star on this one. We've been talking about how COVID changed the world, and the world moved more hybrid working, distributed working. Well, our next guest, he's been working on this for long before COVID, all the way back to the early 70s, and he discovered the benefits back then. Why it's taken us 50 years to try to acknowledge it is a whole different question, but we're really excited to welcome in through the magic of the internet all the way from Southern California. He's Jack Nilles. He coined the term telecommuting. He founded telecommuting, and now he's got his own thing called Jala that he still continues to participate and publish and share his thoughts. So Jack, really, really appreciate you taking the time. Welcome to Work 20XX.
Well, I'm glad to be here. It's good to talk to you.
You too. So let's jump back before we get into the telecommuting and get back to your early days, because I think there's some interesting things there that you participated in. You were doing top secret work for the government, for the space program through the contractors. And there's a couple things about that I think is interesting. One, you talk about later is your multiple disciplinary approach. When you're working on a top secret project like that, I assume a lot of different subcontractors all have lots of different pieces. Nobody gets to see the whole thing together. And that was probably a pretty good experience in terms of working with a lot of different folks with a little bit different objectives and not maybe quite aligned ways of looking at the world. When you think back of that time, what were some of the lessons you learned in working with these multiple distributed organizations back in the 60s on the top secret spy stuff you were working on?
Well, it was, as you say, it was a problem of integrating the work of lots of different people and basically putting the pieces together so that they actually fit. When you put this in a missile and launch it, it's always nice if all the pieces work together.
Yeah.
Right? And so I spent, from my time in the Air Force in starting 1954, and into the aerospace industry after that, I was working with lots of different companies and trying to keep things together, what is now called systems engineering. But they didn't know what to call it then. They just said, just keep the stuff working.
Right.
Keep it from falling apart. Okay. I got used to getting stuck in the middle of stuff I knew nothing about. But I'm usually a fast learner, so I had to do a lot of fast learning over those years. And in fact, at one point, it got most of my stuff in the later part of my aerospace career was doing advanced design of optical reconnaissance satellites. And that's about all I can tell you about it.
Well, the one other piece of this chapter that I want to explore a little bit is the trade-offs. I think what's really interesting to me about aviation engineering, and I'm not an aviation engineer, I know just a little bit to be dangerous, but there's this constant trade-offs, between power versus drag and lift versus weight. And I would imagine in the space program, when you're dealing with ounces and the value of an ounce of payload is so extreme, especially back then, it really must have helped you to kind of distill what are the important things and really, get to a position where you're comfortable making hard trade-offs for the ultimate objective of the mission.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You have to learn, what's the least you can get by with and have it still work properly, because weight is everything in the space business. And I expanded that later to think, well, it's not just in the space business, it's okay. There are things, energy is everything in the rest of the world.
Right.
And in the early 1970s, well, around 1970 exactly. Well, let me back up a little.
Sure.
Once in the midst of all this, when I was living in Los Angeles as a civilian working for the Aerospace Corporation, I got one of these calls from the Pentagon, says, I want you to brief the Undersecretary of the Air Force tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And this was at about 2 in the afternoon the day before in Los Angeles.
And where's the secretary?
In the Pentagon.
In the Pentagon. Okay.
So I had to catch the Moonlight Special, and I cannot sleep on airplanes, and no matter what I try to. So I got on in midnight plane, end up in DC at 6 o'clock in the morning. Had breakfast at the airport, called the Pentagon to make sure about the meeting. He said, well, it's been postponed to 10 o'clock. So, okay, so I went to the Pentagon and had nothing to do, and I waited until 10 o'clock, gave him a call. We're okay, you ready? No, it's been postponed to 2 o'clock. Yeah. So I had lunch in the Pentagon, which is not a gourmet delight. So I got to 1:30. The meeting's been canceled. So I never did get to brief the Undersecretary, who later became the head of National Reconnaissance Office in the Pentagon, on what we were doing. I got on the 5:30 plane, flew back to Los Angeles. Now, in the building I was working in, 2 floors up, there was the general's office. The general had a closed circuit, color encrypted television system connecting directly to the Pentagon. I could have done the briefing that way and saved all this stuff, but I wasn't a general, so I couldn't use it. So I thought, this is really dumb.
Right.
Why are people spending all this time traveling back and forth for nothing? And that struck, this was in the mid 60s. And finally, it kept fermenting in my head. 1970, I started looking around for ways to transfer all this nifty space technology to the real world. And I met an urban planner in Santa Barbara who said, if you guys can put man on the moon, and I said, yeah, because I'd helped them pick the cameras to map the moon so they could land in a place that didn't have a lot of boulders in the way. I said, why can't you do something about traffic? I thought, wow, why not? So the idea took hold of me. He says, how do I get rid of traffic? How do I get rid of? And you start with basic principles again. Why do we have traffic? Well, because there's cars moving around and they get in each other's way. Yes, I realize that. But why are they moving around in the first place? Well, they're going to work and they're working, and then they come back home and they take their cars. And what are they doing when they go to work? Well, most people, or at least half of the people in the cars driving alone on the way to work and clogging the freeways, get to their office and they pick up their phone and talk to somebody somewhere else. I said, this is dumb. Again.
We're still having that same conversation, Jack.
Yeah, why do you have to get in your car and go in the middle of all this traffic, emitting carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, et cetera, to call somebody who's somewhere else? Why don't you do that from home? Okay. I tried to talk my company into doing some research on it because I was secretary of the corporate planning committee. And I told them, here's what we want to, here's what the thing we want to do is test this out with some people. And I said, and make sure it works properly. And they said, well, what would you need to make sure this is good, valid work? And I said, well, we'd have to hire a psychologist or two, maybe a sociologist, and probably a lawyer or two. And they said, wait, forget about it. We're engineers, we're metal benders, we don't deal with this kind of thing. So, well, I got mad about that. So I was complaining about it to a friend of mine at the University of Southern California. I said, you have all the specialties I would need to find out if this works properly. But in my experience, universities aren't that well organized on getting them together. They're each in their own little silo. So I suddenly became USC's first, and as far as I know, only director of interdisciplinary program development. Because my job was to get different schools of the university to work together on important programs that needed help from each one of them, but you had to have the whole works together in order to make it happen.
Right, right.
Right.
Let me stop you for 1 minute, Jack, because there's a couple other things that people might not remember that were happening at that same time in the 70s. First of all, the pollution in the LA basin was horrific.
Yes.
This is before unleaded gases, before a lot of the clean legislation. So, not only was it traffic jams, but the pollution was visible and horrible. And then the other thing that a lot of people today might not remember is we had the oil crisis. I was not driving, but I was old enough to remember that mom had to plan to go get the gas on an
Yes.
even day or an odd day based on what your license plate number was, and there was lines. So you kind of had some of these external shocks right around that same time. Did those have an influence on it, or kind of accelerate the necessity? Or you talked about energy, and you still talk about energy and sustainability and oil and cars and stuff. It's a lot more than commute.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I was still in the Air Force, I'd fly into LA and go into Burbank. And once I went into a store there, and the smog was, it was choking. And I talked to a salesperson there and said, "Do you actually live in this stuff?" Because I live in Ohio, it was cool air there. And she said, "Yes." And said, but it was part of the impetus to get something done about this. We clearly had air pollution. It was clearly doing bad things to the world. And as I finally got into USC, into this, it was just simultaneously the oil crisis. It was purely, I didn't arrange the oil crisis. It was purely coincidental. But we got a grant from the National Science Foundation to do this research on what I called development of policy on the telecommunications-transportation trade-off.
You do it in such an engineering way, right? Again, it's back to trade-offs, and you saw a pretty clear
Trade-off.
opportunity to swap phone calls for commute. I want
Yeah,
to back up again for people that are watching this. This is before mobile phones. This is before email. This is before the internet. And in the defense of the companies, it used to be like one corporate number, and it would go through the switchboard, and they would route it to whoever needed to get it. And all the mail was in envelopes that came through the mailroom every
right.
day. But what I found interesting getting ready for this is you said a number of times that technology was never the barrier. Never. It was always people's willingness to actually try where there was an opportunity. And even in 1973, there was plenty of technology to enable, an increasing amount of people to do more work, not from that central office.
That's right. The first project we set up, I wanted to make sure it was a real world situation, not just an academic exercise with students. So we set it up with a national insurance company who had divisional headquarters in LA. And I asked what they were worried about, and they said, "Well, we have a big turnover program. We have to hire basically a third of our workforce every year, and we'd really like to cut that down. And if you can help us, so fine." Their problem was not something called telecommuter. Their problem was turnover rate. I said, "We can help you severely reduce it by setting up some test projects." And the test beds there were what we call satellite offices scattered at that point in the San Fernando Valley. The employees who worked for the company then did not have to get in their cars and clog up the freeway to get to downtown LA. They could walk, ride their bicycle, take the bus, get to this local satellite center, do their work then, do typing, data entry, data into a mini computer in that same building, which collected all the information and transmitted it overnight over a wideband, T1 line, they used to call it. It was it's what we all have in our homes now,
Right, right.
the company mainframe. Okay. So that technology was okay. It was not good enough to have people work at home because the bandwidth required in the telephone system that gets into households was just not enough to get information across. So we always had, as this example shows, enough technology for people to do their work. Lots of people. Basically, there were always more people available who could do it than were allowed to do it by their management. And that's always been the case.
Right. So you do this seminal report in 1973. You write a book about it in 76, I think. It's really the basis of a lot of the stuff that's come since. And you go and you talk to the head of the insurance company and you say, we're saving you money. Everybody's happy. Turnover's down. Engagement's up. Commuting is down. Nothing but happiness and roses. And they tell you,
no. No. Why not? Well, we're a non-union company, and we figured if we have people, scattered around in these different places, the unions can come in and pick off the places one by one, and the National Labor Relations Board says, it's okay to do that. So before we know it, we'd be unionized. So we're not going to do it, forget about it. A couple months later, I was talking with a strategic planner of the AFL-CIO, and he said, telecommuting is a terrible idea. I said, why? Why? It's great. The people will love it. Your union members will be enthusiastic about it, everything. No. You don't understand. If they're scattered all over the countryside, how will we ever get them organized? Okay. Insurance company will get to organize too easily. Unions, it's too hard to organize them. So based on this look into the future, I said, well, I'm going to have to find some other way to get this going. Much of the 70s to get other departments of the federal government to put some money into broader experiments. And the usual answer was, hey, I'd like you to do telecommuting because it's, it reduces the need for transportation. They said, no. That's not our mission. Our mission is to make automobiles more efficient and traffic signals more interconnected. So it's certainly not having to do with anything to cut down the use of automobiles. I mean, what?
Right.
Talk to the Department of Energy. I can find ways to cut down energy use. Says, no. From automobiles in particular. No. Our mission is to make them more efficient, not to get rid of them. So in everything I presented for several years here, the answer was, no, that's not what we do. We do something else on this.
Right. It's just so rare that you have an opportunity to change behavior and have so many benefits. It's like the ultimate triple bottom line. You get all these benefits for the company in terms of saving money and this, that, and the other. You get all these benefits for the employees in terms of flexibility and better mental health and physical health. And then you have all these benefits to society in terms of, you don't have all these cars on the roads and it, unclogs the roads for the people that have to be there, like trucks and stuff, delivering things. It's so odd to have something that hits on so many factors, but then so difficult for people to accept in terms of really rethinking and changing their behavior. It's like there's no trade-offs. They're all like good. It's like you win on both sides of the scale. Pretty rare.
You know, the culture of the Industrial Revolution sticks. In 1800, nobody worked in big cities and downtown. Big cities were a lot smaller, and there were shopkeepers and so forth and so on. But most of the people lived in the countryside.
Right.
And it was not until we had big factories with really expensive equipment that we had to somehow attract the farm workers to come work and live in the city to run the machines. Okay. And that has apparently drilled into everybody's heads since the mid-19th century.
Right.
And certainly in the 20th. And here I am trying to tear it apart again. You know, I'm a danger to the system.
Well, it's funny too. And I know you know Kate well. I think you wrote the foreword to her book, and I had her on, and she said, you know, the smart companies can use remote and distributed work to basically handle all kinds of problems. You got an employee engagement problem, go increase your remote work. You have a TAMP, you know, you're not getting enough employees. You need to get them from more geography than are available to drive to the office. Go with remote work. I mean, you have sustainability commitments that you've made to the board. Go with remote work. So it's, and then the bizarre one is even like Nick Bloom from Stanford, you know, his seminal piece of research on remote work for the travel company was not, they wanted to save money on real estate, and they figured people were goofing off. They just weren't sure if the goofing off, the loss of productivity more than exceeded the benefit of the cost savings on the real estate. And in fact, to your research, there's all kinds of benefits. You know, productivity goes up, not down.
Yes.
Time working goes up, usually not down. You know, people don't know how to stop work. It's a completely that orthogonal to what you think is going to happen.
Yeah, our biggest problem, as a matter of fact, we just had to get people to stop. You know, stop, relax, enjoy the family, go out and do something else. You know, get rid of the computer, close it in the closet, lock it up.
Right.
And tomorrow, all the management was always worried about productivity, goofing off. People will just find their time doing something else instead, go down the tube. None of that happened. None of it. In every time we tried it. In 1984, we did have another project going with several Fortune 100 companies. Maybe I said, now maybe we'll get the big companies to do it. And they said, yeah, it was great. And they had a good time, but you can't tell anybody about it. Says, but why is this good? It works. It's good. Yeah, we know. But if we've got a way to get something done with very little upfront cost, you know, little technology, some training of people, and productivity goes up, and our retail costs, our space costs go down, and inventiveness goes up. So why should we tell our competitors?
Right.
So here I was back in the top secret business again.
So then we fast forward a little bit more to 9/11, and then in the early 2000s, there's a rash of actually federal legislation that goes down for federal employers, really around continuity, right? In case there's a natural disaster, you know, the Pentagon got shut down for a while to move more work as much as you can, you know, away from these central offices. And yet, you know, we still hear the cries of RTO even within the federal government, even though they have their own regulations in place. And I have them all listed on a webpage of trying to maximize people's time not at the office. So just this constant fighting the tide.
Yeah, Wendell Joyce and the Commerce Department had a hell of a time just getting him started the same way I did, only he was dealing with the federal government. Same resistance from managers They didn't want to do this. They didn't trust their employees, basically. So they weren't sure they were going to do it until they were surprised when it actually happened. They did even better when the manager wasn't there. Wait a minute. Maybe this is getting rid of my job.
Right.
So they've all this resistance is it, and Bloom had a program going in China, I think. Same thing there. I've in the 1990s, my wife and I spent a lot of time commuting to Europe to explain to both industry and the governments there how telework works. And same thing. People tried it, same problems. This is a human condition problem. It is not company X's and government Y's job. It works for everybody. It's a culture change that takes a while to going. And then, all this time from the mid 70s on, I figured, what is the magic trick I can use to get people's minds off the narrow route they've been traveling down for the last 100 years and think about different ways of getting the same stuff done with less energy use, with less air pollution, with less global warming. I wasn't talking about it as global warming in the 70s, but that's what it evolved into with the air pollution. And it was basically, I found it was around a 2-year cycle. I had of going in and talking to the CEO or somebody in upper management. I knew that the workers on the ground wouldn't have a problem with this. It's the upper management and then the middle management that you've got to convince to do it. To go through explaining things to them. Here's how it's done. Here's what you have to do to make it work. You have to look at the legal situation, your policies and procedures, et cetera. So you have to have the right technology. You have to have the bandwidth available. And took about 2 years from my first visit to the time they said, "Oh, okay, let's try it." 2 years.
Wow.
And
just to try it.
that was a constant going. Two non-income years.
Right. Right. Well, I'm curious, as a scientist, you've talked about when you did your multidisciplinary approach, you had Annenberg was one of your participants, right, on the communication. I mean, just I wonder if you could share your thoughts as, humans don't make logical decisions. We make emotional decisions, and the communication and the packaging and the selling of the message is almost, if not more expensive or more important than the actual math or the logic or the rationale behind these things. And I wonder if, as you've kind of been banging your head against the door for a long time, how do you think about the role of communications and the importance of communications when you're trying to help people get through, change, to get people to change their behavior?
A major part of the training we gave people, when they get into this, both managers, particularly managers, but also the teleworkers, is specifically on communication. Is that we have them write down and diagram or do something about who they talked to and what the subject was, for a couple of weeks before any of this happens. Write it down, draw a chart of it, and so all your communication methods, interconnections and media are there. And now what we're going to do is make all the same communications happen, but using electronic media instead of you're walking around and talking to them or driving someplace to do it. And that's the substitution. We got to get you to keep thinking about the communication. Is it getting done? Is it getting done on time to the right people? And once they change their focus, it's all of a sudden, wow, oh yeah, this is, I see the lights going off again. So, uh,
So then COVID hits, and suddenly, within a few days' time, like March 13th to March 16th, right around there, people are sent home. So suddenly companies are forced into this way of working. They haven't had any planning, they haven't had any preparation, they haven't had any training. And lo and behold, it actually works. So, I mean, COVID did a lot of horrible and terrible things, and we don't want to discount that. But from what it did in terms of finally forcing people to acknowledge that this could work because they didn't have an option. Oh my goodness, what a light switch moment for you and the entire industry. Kate likes to say she was chasing the rock, then suddenly it turned and started chasing her down the hill in April 2020.
that was my magic wand was COVID. You know, the way to fix this around is just have a good pandemic every now and then. This is not the way to do things, but it sure worked.
Yeah.
We had, several in the interim between 1970 and 2020. There were several disaster situations, earthquakes, fires, et cetera, in which we once again demonstrate, hey, you can get your company back working together, get your people working from home. The phone lines get repaired a lot faster than the freeways do in LA when there's a big earthquake. And they adopt it all right away, for 2 or 3 months. But as my experience gained, I said, you got to have 2 or 3 years of this working well before it really takes root. And that's what's happened now after COVID. It's 2 or 3 years, but the CEOs are still saying, I want everybody back in the office. They're not going to come back.
No.
Long enough to take hold.
Yeah, for behaviors to change. The whole thing kind of reminds me of biking, and biking as a substitution for cars. And you've got Amsterdam that's been doing it for 40 years, and then actually Paris has done quite a bit in the last 10. But all these externalities, all these side benefits that come from quieter streets and less pedestrian deaths, and kind of people getting back to their neighborhoods, and we all experienced kind of the quiet streets early COVID days. But it's just so hard to change people's behavior and their perceptions of this is the way we do it, even though, to your point, we didn't do it this way really not that long ago.
That's right. So we used to, do continuous cost benefit analyses on this stuff. And even with the stuff you could quantify, like cost of telecommunications, cost of space, etc., that benefit in almost any corporate situation we looked at, we could not possibly quantify all these other benefits. Like, well, we could quantify people are more relaxed or feel more creative, their family life is better, except with teenagers. They dealt with the community, all this stuff that has pervasive effects ultimately on the way people live and work together. But I don't know how to write down that so an accountant will appreciate it.
Right. Well, I think you captured a lot of it in that one case study in terms of turnover, right? Because if those things aren't working well, that's one way to measure it. I want to shift gears a little bit, Jack, again, back to your science hat and your tech hat, and just get your thoughts on how the tech has changed. Because even though technology was not necessarily the barrier, like you said, it was the gray mass between the boss's ears, technology has changed so dramatically. And in the office's defense, like I said, there was a lot of stuff that was work that was there that you had to go get out of the file cabinet, or get your notes that somebody left for you on a piece of paper in a little round plastic thing that sat on your desktop before voicemail. But as you look at technology and the advances of communication technology, we're still kind of fighting this battle. But what gets you excited about the future, and what this massive kind of change and scale of compute that we now have for so less money than back in the day, and really what that's going to enable.
Well, I mean, the basic dimension there is bandwidth. The wider bandwidth you have, the more varied the work you can do. At the beginning, we had telephone bandwidth, and you could do, data entry kinds of things, but you certainly couldn't do artwork or complex communications and so forth that required, some kind of face-to-face interaction, or you had to go someplace else to do it because it took big, expensive machinery. So as the bandwidth available increased, as for example, when personal computers appeared on March 18th, 1981, the IBM PC was announced. Now the PC, your office could be taken home, because all the stuff you use in the office, or a good part of it, was in this box that you had in your house. Now it can be in your telephone.
Right.
So the cost of the technology keeps going down. The bandwidth it's available in terms of who you can communicate with effectively, how you can transfer data, how you can transmit feelings even, continually expands. And as it expands, it increases the ability of people to work remotely in all sorts of situations that would have been completely impossible from an expense point of view than it was, 5, 10, 10 decades ago.
Yeah. It's amazing. There's a lot of little memes out there that show, like all the things that are on your desk, and they all slowly just get sucked up by your phone, from the kids' pictures to your contact database to calling people and mailing people and everything else. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the role of the government, and what kind of how you think about where the role of the government is in this, both from kind of a carrot perspective as well as a stick perspective. And we saw, in your early career, huge investment in small electronics, chasing Sputnik, and that drove a lot of development, which then created a lot of interesting technology that got put all over the place, like microprocessors. There's incentives for, buying EVs. So the government can really, change things pretty significantly with either incentives or with penalties. What do you think the role of regulation is to kind of help move this thing along?
Well, there are various roles, and the initial role in government for me was simply a grant from the National Science Foundation to do the research. But they wouldn't go further than that in applied research, because NSF only did fundamental research on things. So I ran up against the roadblock in getting the more applied things going, because the departments that were involved in applied stuff didn't believe in this to begin with. So that, the government's head have to get turned around as well, so they can, FCC can change the rules on who has access to what sorts of information, how it's protected. Certainly the protection problem is a continuing issue. Security, you want to be able to communicate with anybody, but not accidentally with somebody else you don't want to get involved in this thing. So the legal background for this, the technological background, still needs to keep going, so that we can interact with people safely and securely. And the secure part is still a major issue to be going on, and even now. Well, that's worldwide. That's a problem, Or you go to China, there is no leakage outside, well, except for the people who know how to do it.
Right.
So government can, at all levels, gets involved. Many local governments have ordinances that prohibit people from working at home. one of the things I did with a project we had with the city of Los Angeles is get them to change their work codes so that people could, in fact, be working at home as long as they didn't have crowds of people coming to their door, that sort of thing. But restrictions like this impede people from living the way that they should be able to in this new kind of a situation. It's one of these things where there's no big single pervasive rule that says if we make the following law, everything's fixed. No, it's bits and pieces here. You have to nibble away at the restrictions on free and easy communications. You have to also nibble away at the issues of providing incentives for people to do this, which can mean, zoning laws, income tax for the things you can deduct and the things you cannot. That goes for the employer as well as the employee, and so forth and so on. I don't really have a whole big list of such things, but there's all kinds of ways you can tweak the edges to make it more effectively feasible for all sorts of people.
Right. And then what are kind of your thoughts now where, a year ago, it seemed like we'd kind of gotten through the crucible, everyone kind of adjusted and grew that this is okay and we're moving forward. And then like every August, like back to school, we have back to the office, we have the RTO. Brian Elliott likes to call it RTO season, return to office every August. And it never works. So when you look forward 50 years, crazy, what gets you excited, and then what gets you less excited and concerned, specifically around this topic, and then more generally?
Yeah, this gets off the subject a little bit, but the education system still needs a lot of work. After we did the telecommuting research, I did a technology assessment of the personal computer in 1978. And one of the topics we focused on was education. And we basically came to the conclusion that education is so fragmented that it is hard to make a learning tool that is easily adaptable to each and every educational district because they have their own wants and needs. It's just the economics don't work out for this.
Yeah.
And the attitudes are still the same.
Although, as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, this is the ubiquitous thing that every single kid has in their pocket. Maybe it's time that we readjust the education system to work through the phone for a significant piece.
Yeah. And, we should make use of the technology, but don't get addicted to it is the other end of this thing.
Right.
It's getting the workers to stop working. It works with whatever nifty electronic instrument you have to say, hey, this is really cool, but stop, do something else.
And then what are you working on? Give us kind of the latest what you're working on with Jala and what's keeping you up and keeping you writing and keeping you engaged.
I'm working mostly at the sort of the next macro level up from Jala. Saying, how do we get this method of examining the world more broadly spread than it is right now? How is it possible that we have factions in the United States of people basically at each other's throat for what? Why is this? How do we stop this sort of thing? I'm trying to get my hands around it. It's much more complicated than just trying to get a company to think about different ways to let his people work. So I said, I'm used to getting in trouble. So now I'm doing it only on my own hook. I don't have to need grants from anybody. I have enough income so I can harp at anybody about doing this properly regardless.
Yeah.
Jala is a intentionally nonprofit now.
You just wonder if, the younger companies who kind of grew up this way in terms of both their management structure as well as that they're younger kids, they're more digitally native, they're just more used to that, as they begin to displace incumbents in particular industries, when they go to Wall Street and say, let's get out the balance sheet and the income statement, one's going to have huge real estate expense and one's not. And at some point, do the financial analysts on Wall Street start saying you can't justify this expense anymore? Is that what's going to finally move it?
One of my colleagues at USC was invested in trying to develop the executive boardroom, and basically the corporate headquarters would be this one place, it's made 500 square feet, where there'd be executives would come in connected to everybody else around. So, hey, they know what's going on minute by minute. And that's clearly within the available technology now, particularly as artificial intelligence accompanied by artificial stupidity keeps growing. We're good at that just as well. But the kids, just don't have any problem with this. I'm still talking to a diminishing cadre of people as they age and fall off the cliff. Hey, I'm 91. What can I tell you?
Yeah, still going strong. I love it. It's just sad that we're still having the same conversation that you validated 50 years ago with hard facts and science, and it just goes to show that people don't make decisions based on logic. They make it based on emotion, which was always my hard time with economics. Like, these are beautiful curves, but that's not the way people work,
No, it's the technology moves a lot faster than our brains do. So culture is basically the deciding speed of things here. The kids will adopt new things much faster, and the problem for us older folks is, should we keep arguing with them or just get out of the way?
Yeah, I think it's time to get out of the way. Well, Jack, I really appreciate all the work that you've put in this over the last 50 years. It's a foundation for so many other people's great work and exploring it. And it's so bizarre and weird to find something that has so many benefits on so many axes across the board. It's like the ultimate non-engineering thing. There's very little trade-offs and a whole lot of benefits on both sides.
Well, and I also went to a liberal arts college, which I blame everything on.
That's right. But it's funny now they're saying that's the way to go because ChatGPT is going to write all the code tomorrow. So it's good to have that critical thinking and a little bit more liberal arts background to think about these things and have that filter. Well, Jack, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. You're 91 years young, you're kicking tail, and appreciate that you're still blogging all the time. So thanks a lot, and again, really a treat to catch up with you today.
It was a pleasure.
All right. He's Jack. I'm Jeff. You're watching Work 20XX. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening on the podcast. We'll catch you next time. Take care. Great. Jack, that was terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Let's do this again sometime.